Then, good afternoon, welcome. My name is Wolf Brunner. I'm the director of the USC Shaw Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Alex Hinton, who comes to us from Rutgers University, Newark. Yeah, that's what I learned. First I wanted to thank, because this event was made possible by co-sponsorship of the UC Center for Visual Anthropology, and as a representative, Nancy Lütkehaus is here, so thanks for that. And to introduce Alex Hinton, he is widely known in the genocide field because he was president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars in previous years, and has published widely on this topic. He has a PhD in anthropology from Emory University. And one of his books, Why Did They Kill Cambodia in the Shadow of Genocide, published in 2005, is kind of his most widely known book, and received the Robert B. Textor Family Prize for Excellence in Anticipatory Anthropology. And says, and I think this is really kind of symbolic for his work, that he developed a distinctively anthropological approach to genocide. And this shines also in his other published work. He is the editor and co-editor of 9 different collections. Several of them are kind of covering the topic of genocide from very different angles: memory, transitional justice, but also, which is not so often the case still, but at the time when he published the book Colonial Genocide, Indigenous North America, this was much less a topic than it is today. He is an academic advisor of the Documentation Center in Cambodia, and also he is a member of the International Advisory Board of the journal Genocide Studies and Prevention, and the Journal of Genocide Research, so we are on the same board there. That's good company, I hope. He was a member and also a visitor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. And a little bit what is the topic of today, but also of a book which he is planning to publish, is that he is very much involved with the Khmer Rouge tribunals in Cambodia, and this is a little bit where this work comes from, and probably the next book. And so please give a warm welcome to Alex Hinton.
It's good. I've got 2 waters to go. I feel like I need to take it.
More probably with that king.
Who? Comrade Duch's abecedarian. A, apology. B, black ink. C, confession, conversion, Christianity. D, Duch, eldest son, star student, loner, math teacher, meticulous. Khmer Rouge revolutionary, patriot, party member, dutiful, prison commandant, brute. Eyes and ears of the party, obedient, gave orders, stoic, fanatic, torturer, father, cog in the machine, believer, mass murderer, prisoner imprisoned, the accused, defendant, criminal, convict. E, enemies, attacking from without, burrowing from within. F, first, extract their information. Next, assemble many points for pressuring them so they cannot move. Propagandize and pressure them politically. 4, pressure and interrogate them by cursing. 5, torture. 6, examine and analyze the responses for further interrogation. 7, examine and analyze the responses to make the document. 8, guard them closely. Prevent them from dying. Don't let them hear one another. 9, maintain secrecy. G, ghost, suspended between lives, watching, awaiting justice, karma, and offering to the dead, merit, rebirth. H, cannot hesitate and have ideological doubts that hinder our task, even if that person is our brother or sister or someone whom we trusted. I, interrogation note to Duch. The situation of interrogating Gaigam Huat alias Sat. On the morning of July 21st, 1977, we pounded him another round. Electrical wire and feces. This time he cursed those who hit him very much and said, "Go ahead and beat me to death." Had him eat 2 or 3 spoonfuls of feces. By nightfall, we went at him again with electric wires, this time pretty seriously. He became delirious. He was all right. Later he confessed a bit, as reported above. Sat said he had nothing to answer to send to Angka, and since he did not know what to say, that now he just waits for death, and he can close his eyes and die easily because he has sacrificed and was loyal to the party. My operative line is to continue with torture with mastery, because the enemy is breaking emotionally and is at a dead end. Along with this, I ask for opinion and guidance from Angka in carrying out this task. J, join the revolution to liberate the country. K, Gaigam Huat alias Sat, Duch's teacher, mentor, comrade, prisoner. Dim Sorun, Gaigam Huat's wife, also a teacher, interrogated, tortured, sexually abused. L, the line, party line determining politics, ideology, organization, arrest, imprisonment, interrogation, torture, execution. Quote, the crimes came from the party line of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. Anyone considered an enemy was to be smashed. M, man or monster, mathematical calculation, quote, make them think of their wives and children, mastery. N, numbers, the S21 statistics list. 90% of the people are strong and firmly believe in the party, the collective, and defend the party. 10% are weak. 1% are very weak. 1% therefore are enemies. Screen out the enemies no matter what. O, the objective of torturing is to get their answers. It is not done for fun. Therefore, we must make them feel pain so that they will respond quickly. Another objective is to make them afraid. It is not done by individual anger to let off steam. Therefore, beat them to make them scared, but absolutely not to let them die. When torturing, it's imperative to check their health in advance and to inspect the whip. Do not get greedy and want to be quick. That leads to death and loss of a document. P, psychological functioning. Obsessive, low self-esteem, depression, traumatic organization, dysympathy, splitting, willing participant, need for mentors and strong belief, avoidance, narcissistic self-depreciation, negation, projection, repression, displacement, inhibited dream activity, reaction formation, somatization, avoidance, rationalization, denial. Q, qualifications for joining the party. 18 years or older, already tested, follows the party line, the party ideological and organizational stances, good class pedigree, clean morals and politics, never involved with enemies, clean personal history. R, revolution, return, revenge. S, smash, to crush or reduce to nothing. A scream, silence. T, torture by hand, rod, club, whip, electrical current, waterboarding, suffocation by plastic bag, pliers pulling out toe and thumbnails, pouring salty water on wounds, eating feces, drinking urine, rape, exposure, poisonous insects, paying homage to the image of a dog. U, ugly habits, talking to other groups, not maintaining typewriters, must be vigilant. It is careless, taking a pregnant woman to a new house. She cuts her belly open. When we get sleepy, put the enemy back. V, voice, victim, voiceless. W, wheel of history, samsara, wheel of life. X, no exit, hostage and actor, caught in the gears of the revolutionary machine. Y, you must be vigilant. First, rough work is careless work, a conflict with the collective. Second, morality with females. Z, zero, empty, no enemies, unmarked. It's always a little hard to shift out of that frame. Interrogative, 6 queries. Who, what, why, when, where, and how. Who was Duch? At the museum, the Tool-Sling Museum of Genocidal Crimes, on Building B, the 2nd floor, room 2. Evil, black ink staining white cloth. The word is written across the neckline of the man's polo shirt in a photograph at the Tool-Sling Genocide Museum in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. A caption names him Duch. Duch's head rises from the shirt collar, too large for his slight build. Pressed into a line, his lips conceal bad teeth. In the background, a man in a dark suit is a shadow behind Duch. Someone has scribbled in white marker across Duch's eyes, which glow demonic. Another person has given him a small pointy goatee, the kind associated with the devil. The picture is uncanny. Some visitors to the museum would recognize Duch as the Khmer Rouge cadre who ran a secret security prison, S-21, at the site from 1976 to 1979. In the mid-1960s, Duch, who was born in 1942, had joined the Khmer Rouge, a Maoist-inspired group of Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries who had risen to power on the ripples of the Vietnam War. Upon taking control on April 17, 1975, They enacted policies leading to the deaths of roughly 2 million of Cambodia's 8 million inhabitants, almost a quarter of the population, before being deposed by a Vietnamese-backed army on January 6, 1979. During DK, Democratic Kampuchea, the period of Khmer Rouge rule in Cambodia, over 12,000 people, some say as many as 20,000, passed through the gates of S-21, which Duch ran beginning in March 1976. Almost all of the prisoners were executed, many after being interrogated and tortured into making a confession. Evil. A picture is worth 1,000 words, the saying goes. One look tells the story. What more needs to be said? I look again. So who was Duch? As I said, Duch was born in 1942. He was ethnic Chinese. His family was poor, and he had an uncle who he viewed as extorting money from the family, so he was a victim of usury. He was a brilliant student. He was a mathematician and eventually became a mathematics teacher, joining the Khmer Rouge Revolutionary Movement in 1967. So during the course of a trial, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment, he identified 3 sort of events in his life that had an impact upon him. First, there was an inspirational teacher. That teacher was sought, the person whose interrogation I read, who was forced to eat feces. That was Duch's former teacher. But he said he was a big influence on him and started teaching about class oppression. As I mentioned before, the usury by a Chinese uncle, and he also said that he had always felt badly about his Chinese ethnicity, but when relations with China got better and a Chinese premier visited, he said that he began to sort of take pride in his Chinese heritage. When he was about 20, he claimed there were a certain number of events that took place. He had a romantic failure. One thing that was interesting about that is that his girlfriend at the time, who he wanted to marry, he wanted her to go into mathematics, and she decided to go into literature. And because of that, they said we had to part ways and go in 2 different paths. He also said he followed Stoicism, and he met his mentor when he was in Phnom Penh at the Institute of Pedagogy, Son Sen, who would rise up and become the DK Minister of Defense. So more proximately, his path to the revolution was also informed by the theft of his bicycle. So basically, he couldn't go on, go to the university, and had to get a degree in teaching instead of getting a doctorate. Also, 10 of his friends were arrested and treated brutally, and he said this was another factor that led him to want to join. So again, who was Duch? He became a teacher at a secondary school, and he was one of his students who testified at his trial said the following. He was a firm and meticulous teacher who was appreciated and beloved by his students. He was gentle and kind. He showed particular concern and kindness towards poor students. He even provided them with free writing materials like pens, pencils, books, and extra lessons. His behavior was smooth, and I never observed him get angry or have a conflict with others. So again, several of his former students testified along these lines. So what did Duch do? Well, he went on trial in 2009 at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. So, the DK regime ended in 1979. As I noted before, the tribunal, didn't begin to even be thought about or become possible until the late 1990s and the 2003 signing agreement. Because of different political disputes, it wasn't until 2006 that the tribunal commenced. The first indictments were 2007. Duch went on trial in 2009, and the second case began in 2011. The final decision in Duch's trial was in 2012. So this is an international hybrid tribunal. How many people know what an international hybrid tribunal is? Yeah, so this is in contrast to the ad hoc tribunals in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. These are ones that blend together, right? They're called mixed tribunals. Cambodian, in this case, Cambodian and international personnel. And so you can see the Cambodian personnel, and these are lawyers and judges and prosecutors, right? Here is the trial chamber in the court. There's the UN, right, hybrid logo with a little Angkorian figure. So this is what the courtroom and the gallery, what it looks like looking in. It's very much like a show. And Duch was tried for his crimes at S21. So as I said before, he was detained in 2007. In 2009, the trial began. 2010, there was the verdict. And 2012, you got the final decision. So what did Duch do? Well, he was accused, legally at least, of crimes against humanity and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. He's not accused of genocide. That's a charge that has come out in the second case. And we'll get a decision about that probably early next year for the targeting of ethnic Vietnamese as well as Muslim Jams. So when did Duch do this? So I had, you read through this before, but this took place. I know many of you are familiar with DK history, but I know some aren't, so I want to just briefly go over the outline of it. But the Khmer Rouge, sorry, I had a transfer problem. The Khmer Rouge, there was French colonial rule before the 1950s. In 1953, you had independence. And at that time, some of the independence forces were basically communist revolutionaries. Long story, some of them went to Vietnam. Most of them felt sold out by the agreement that was brokered in 1953, at which point King Sihanouk came to power. The Khmer Rouge, during the 1960s, towards the end of them, they began to rise in power as the Vietnam War escalated, which impacted Cambodia in 1968. They began armed struggle. In 1970, Prince Sihanouk, who had ruled the country since independence in 1953, he was toppled in a coup. And at that point, the Khmer Rouge really began to get support. By 1973, you can see, right, the red versus non-red. The Khmer Rouge controlled most of the country. And also, we had intensive U.S. bombing in 1973 as well, which further intensified the support for the Khmer Rouge. And basically by 1973, 1974, everyone knew the Khmer Rouge were going to win. So Khmer Rouge came to power in 1975, toppled in 1979. And again, the key terms to remember, I might say DK a lot, which is the period of Khmer Rouge rule. Khmer Rouge, a group of Maoist-inspired Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries led by Pol Pot, who is right there. In this train car, you have most of the top leaders of the Khmer Rouge. Nguyen Gia is there, Damak. People's Republic of Kampuchea, which I won't talk about, is the regime that followed the Khmer Rouge. It was a socialist regime. How many people have been to Tuol Sleng? Oh, so a fair number of people. But this was the museum that was set up at the site of S21. People now sometimes say Tuol Sleng instead of S21, but it was called S21 at the time. It became Tuol Sleng. The Khmer Rouge Tribunal I just told you about, and Duch again, here he is on trial. But in terms of the backdrop, the context in which, right, so we traced over very briefly the Khmer Rouge rise to power. When they took control, they rusticated or emptied the urban population. So you see the exodus, all the cities, everybody had to leave and go to the countryside, where they eventually, some places sooner, some later, went to work on cooperatives. Buddhism was banned and other forms of religious worship. There were no markets. Everything was collectivized. Eventually, as I said before, nobody knows how many people, maybe 2.2 million out of a population of 8 million, roughly a quarter of the population died, and up to 20,000, as I said before, at tool slaying. Okay, where did Duch? So again, I wanted to, sort of get in as we go through. I'll get into some of the methodological strategies of the book, but I wanted to launch at the beginning with the abecedarian. But I also wanted to do a ritual behavior, which I forgot to do, which is to thank all of you for coming, and thank the Center and the Shoah Foundation for hosting me. Thanks to Professor Gruner, Professor Smith, Professor Stroud, Marika, the communications team, everybody else who I've forgotten to mention, but I've been very impressed. Everything's very impressive, the way things have been run so smooth, so well, and everyone's been so friendly, so thank you. Normally I would have said that at the beginning, but I'll take this moment. So we're back to our queries, right? Who was Duch? Where? When? So Duch, as I said before, headed S21, right, which was directly linked to the DK Party Center. At the time, in terms of the DK chain of command, there were security centers and security operations that took place on the zone level, sectors, districts, communes. Has anyone seen Angelina Jolie's new movie? Yeah, so you see there very much further down, right, what's taking place on the commune level and the district level, right? She's not really talking about what's going on at the security level or zone level, and you don't get much context. But that's an example of some of the things that were taking place on a very low level. Duch was directly linked through his patron Son Sen to the party center, and this made S21 different. So again, in terms of what was taking place, and again, for those of you who've seen First They Killed My Father, you saw people creeping about at night, right? So you had local monitoring, re-education camps, biography, self-criticism sessions, but also these security centers. S21 is located in Phnom Penh, which is the capital of Cambodia. So if you go here, right, to the site, there's S21 in the city of Phnom Penh. And if you go to this site, this is what is now the Tool Slaying Museum. However, as true with many memorial sites, what you see is not exactly what existed at the time. And so people were interrogated and tortured and killed where other people are now living around the Tool Slaying Museum. And they usually say everybody was taken and interrogated in this building, Building A, but in fact people were being, this compound, even here you can see how far it stretches in the city. People were being taken all over. Duch, S21 was pretty big, over 2,000 people, it was said. So he was at the head of it, 1976, lots of units, but you had the guard unit, the special unit, but you also had a unit of interrogators. And there were male interrogators until there was gendered violence, sexual immorality as they referred to it. And then they took some of the interrogator wives and turned them into a female interrogation unit. Okay, so how did Duch do this? So this is a prisoner, Bu Mang. The people who have been to Tool Slaying, if it's relatively recently, you would have seen two former prisoners, Bu Mang and Jum Mai, sitting at tables across from each other. It's a longer story I talk a little bit about in my book. So you have these former prisoners who then have publications that they sell, and people come and take pictures of them. One of them is Bu Mang. He painted about 100 paintings that tell the story of his life. This was commissioned by the Documentation Center of Cambodia. And I should note that many of the images that I'm using are from the Documentation Center of Cambodia archive, and I want to thank them for letting me use the images in these paintings. So Bu Mang testified, and here's a picture of the survivors, although you asked me earlier how many are there, and there are more than this, but that's Van Nat. Bu Mang's the shortest person. Jum Mai, who sells his book, is over there, who also sells a book. But this is Bu Mang, He was working in the countryside, and he had been a painter, and he was told he was going to go teach at the School of Fine Arts. So he got in a Jeep. He was driven, and then he said, uh-oh, they turned in a different direction. They pulled up at S21. There's the gate. They were blindfolded. They were taken in and photographed. After being photographed, they were separated. He never saw his wife again. He was put first in a communal cell where people would go often unless they were important prisoners. Eventually, he was tortured, at which point he went to an individual cell. By the way, tool slaying also is a former school, so the teacher took a former school and turned it into a torture center. And then this is a picture of Boumeng being tortured. People were tortured until they confessed. They often had to write and rewrite their confessions. Boumeng survived because he could paint, and they needed people to make revolutionary art. So he worked with a few other artisans. Other people had skills like Jumai was able to fix generators. So this handful of people all had some sort of skill, but Boumeng's skill was painting, and he had to paint portraits of Pol Pot. So Boumeng in his trial said, the interrogators kept asking, who introduced you into the CIA? What were their names? I couldn't think of any mistake I'd made. I didn't know what the CIA network was, so they just kept beating me. I have a lot of scars on my back from that torture. So again and again, he said, I had no idea what they wanted. They tortured him. They'd use the word KGB or CIA, say, I don't know who they are, and they would just beat him over and over again. How did Duch do this? In the torture chamber, September 29th, 1976. Confession note of Comrade Ya. I have read and responded. There was no coercion while writing this. However, please kindly note that my response since the night of 28 September 1976, my responses were made after I was severely and strongly tortured. Duch's reply, do not write these words that I have crossed out and read. You do not have the right to report on such matters to the organization. I have the right. I reported already. Do not play tricks and deny this. So again, this was on his interrogation note. This is what he had to rewrite it to say. And here it is in Khmer. So we have a draft confession, right? The prisoner does it, makes the note here that I read to you, and then you get Duch coming in, annotating, and you get the revision, the rearticulation, and the redaction. Ultimately, this is the cover sheet of a confession, and all the confessions listed names of co-conspirators, which often were just people someone knew because they were being tortured until they wrote down a bunch of names. So what happened after confession? Everybody would be taken out and clubbed in the back of the head and killed. Some people were killed at S21, but most went to a site called Chung Ike, where those who went to tool slaying probably also visited at the time. Why? Why did Duch do this? Well, quick explanations. This comes from the title of the book, or I should say the title of the book comes from the quick explanation, Man or Monster. This was a newspaper headline right as Duch went on trial, but it wasn't the only one. He and his fellow Khmer Rouge are often described as monsters, evil. Again, every time now we have attacks that are taking place in the U.S., same language is often used, monsters, barbarians, savages, and there's a way, evil. And certainly in terms of the emotion and the horrible things that take place, that's accurate, but as an explanation, it really doesn't do all that much for you. Anyway, so this trope circulated during Duch's trial. This is one manifestation. There's a program that was done each week about the week's events during the trial. There was a show called Duch on Trial. And they came out and said, at one point, so during this week, it looked like there were two Duchs. One was the emotionalist prison boss who was zealous, a fanatic, and this was mirrored by the prosecution arguments. Then Duch would speak, and they'd say, on Tuesday, we had a true human being, someone who himself was imprisoned by the regime, who was full of remorse, breaking down in tears. As I mentioned briefly, so Duch, there was a huge amount of evidence, right, that incriminated him. He was going to be convicted. Whatever someone says about a show trial, it doesn't matter in this case. There's just so much overwhelming evidence. There's no way that he would be let go. So the defense strategy was for him, one of the defense strategies, to cooperate. So he began and apologized at the very beginning of the trial. Was he genuine? Over time, many civil parties didn't believe that he was genuine. He was faking remorse to get a reduced sentence, but he did apologize and he did cooperate, though many people thought his cooperation was limited to those things where there was evidence. So if there was evidence, he would say, yes, that's true, of course. But if there wasn't, he would say, well, there's no evidence. So again, this was one of those dynamics, but he was cooperating and he apologized and showed remorse. So again, this is one of those tensions that was an undercurrent in his trial. So why did he do this? Another part here, I'm not going to read, I'll just summarize it. There are many different moments in his trial that seem to be somewhat revealing, but one of those moments was a day when Duch was being questioned by a French judge, and they talked about when he joined the party. And Duch at the time suddenly stood up from his chair, stood straight, and took his hand and did a revolutionary salute. And he recalled the moment he was inducted into the party, and it seemed almost at that moment as if it was yesterday. It's one of those deep memory moments where he was back at the time, and it really showed his passion. And so what did Duch say? Why did he do it? He wanted to save the country, right? The poor people, the people like his student, right, who he helped at school. That was why he said he joined and became a revolutionary. Why did Duch do this? Another explanation, psychology. Duch underwent a psychological evaluation on the request of the defense, right? So it wasn't the prosecution, it was the defense. A French psychoanalyst and a Cambodian psychiatrist did the evaluation. And during the abecedarian, I read some of their many findings about Duch. But again, obsessive, inhibited dream activities, coping, narcissistic self-depreciation. There were lots of explanations for his personality. Said he had all sorts of defense mechanisms. Right? There's always the danger of looking at the DSM because it's a big checklist, and you always get worried you have all of them as well. But they threw the book at him in terms of defense mechanisms. Said he had a traumatic organization of, there was a traumatic organization of society that was reflected by the traumatic organization of the individual. He actually drew on an anthropologist. I won't go into that sort of side story because, I won't digress. Anyways, but again, so basically the explanation was given is that he is very dysfunctional in many ways. But ultimately, going back to what he said, he was sort of someone who was caught up in the revolutionary movement, brainwashed, and fulfilled his revolutionary duties. But he was not a sociopath. Why did Duch do this? Another stream of explanation. To go back to your computer is too fancy for me. Right, the DK anthem. So this is the DK national anthem, Blood Our Blood covers the towns. You have the Khmer Rouge flag, which is blood red because of revolutionary struggle. And here's another sort of interesting, in terms of ideology, symbol. This is the DK coat of arms, right? The national symbol. And you see a factory. Probably many of you said, hey, that looks a bit like Auschwitz in the train tracks. Did anyone think that when you saw that? No? Anyways, some people have said that, right? Like you lead in. But in fact, this is industry. You have the grid-like framework, which in many ways encapsulates the thinking of the Khmer Rouge, where they were going to take society, reconstruct it. People were called elements. It was a Buddhist term. Units to be taken and used in certain ways. Some were to be eliminated. And then the Glorious Revolution would lead to industry, prosperity, and as the 4-year plan said, dessert once a week. That was part of their 4-year plan. Duch mentioned this and said, look, DK party line was everything. At one point, Pol Pot referred to it, and it's all over Khmer Rouge revolutionary tracks. Pol Pot himself said, without this line, which gives judicious guidance, one becomes blind. Of course, Pol Pot and Nguyen Gia were the two people who were formulating the party line. Another thing about Duch, why did Duch do this? He had this quote in a psychological evaluation, one cannot live without belief. So another explanation, don't really have time to go into it, but this notion that Duch is someone who always was very passionate, so he embraced communism and revolutionary ideals. In the 1990s, he embraced Christianity and became an evangelical Christian and followed the path of God. He said, that's why I'm confessing, because God would want me to, and sometimes when we went into court, he carried a Bible. For those who don't know, Cambodia is a predominantly Buddhist country, though of course the Khmer Rouge, banned Buddhism, so the Khmer Rouge were atheistic, though they made the party regime itself almost like a deity. So Duch, in his own defense, he would cite the DK party statutes, and he said, they told us everything. This is a party line. We all have to be pure. Anyone who's not pure is suspect. They had a saying that a person was like, taking a person and correcting them, making them proper revolutionaries was like hammering iron. And there's a term for it, lutom, which is to forge people, right, until they're the proper revolutionaries, and it took a lot of effort to do that. In March 1976, Khmer Rouge, they killed a number of people right when they came to power, especially members of the old regime. By the early 1976, there began to be suspicions. So anyways, Duch would cite this. And he said, there are only 4, if you look here, there are 4 groups who had the power to smash. He said, I wasn't one of them. I wasn't there, I just followed orders. He said, Khmer Rouge ideology, right? They told us who we were and who they were. So we would target them and we would smash them. And so also in Khmer, the word for smash, as I read in the Obsidiarian, means literally, like this hand, to crush something to dust. And, so he said this basically. So we were told to smash, like the orders, and so to take them so nobody would know, to completely eradicate them. At S21, people say who was targeted. It wasn't one group. It changed over time. First it was Lon Nol officials and class enemies. And then you began to get the internal purges. People always talk about perpetrators, gray zones. Bumang, who everyone, I assume, who doesn't know much about Bumang, coded immediately as sort of a victim. He was a former Khmer Rouge. Right, so this was another sort of theme in the trial that emerged that were sort of more or less pure civil parties and victims. But he was caught up in the internal purges. In 1978, war with Vietnam broke out, and suddenly everybody who was linked to Vietnam, and they sometimes said people who had Vietnamese minds, people would have Khmer bodies but Vietnamese minds, those people all started to come in and be targeted. They were taken and killed. So why did Duch do this? Well, so I've been giving you some of his explanations. Remember this, this is Long Mui's confession. I discuss, anyways, he brought this up and used a confession to defend himself. And this struck me as kind of odd, so I actually did research to try and find out who Long Mui was. And I talk about that some in my book. And I went and eventually talked to his brother, and I recount that, but I won't digress. But what's interesting about this is what Duch did. I think he used a pin when he pointed. He said, look, there I am, that's Duch. He didn't say, there's Duch. He said, this is my handwriting. Right? He went through, and these are sort of instructions about the cadre. Long Mui, who is ethnic Chinese as well, and there was a Chinese network. And he said, look, I wrote my stuff there, and then I sent it up to Son Sen, my patron, right? Minister of Defense. He's the person who was overseeing everything. I just kicked it up to him. And then he goes, look at that check mark. And they paused, and he said, that's Pol Pot. And they said, look, Pol Pot gave orders. They went back to Son Sen, right, who wrote his orders, kicked it back to me, and I just relayed them to my subordinates. I was a relay point. Yeah, so this is a confession that he used in his own defense. So he could show went all the way to the top to Pol Pot, and also, this also is structured hierarchically, of course. So he's lower, and it goes up. The higher you are where you're writing, it shows your status. It's kind of.
Tell us what he wrote there?
He's right. So he's talking about this fellow, right? Long Mui, right there, Juan, who was in the translation unit. So he talks about the translation unit as being corrupt. That's one thing. He was from a district, and in that district there were a lot of ethnic Chinese who were actually sort of linked to Maoist China, and they turned them around to be sort of counter-revolutionary Chinese. This is what they always did. They just flip everything around. And he talks about his patron basically in this last line still being alive. Like we need to check out this network. So they're basically saying there's a network we need to look into. There are actually a couple of networks, and this is what they would do: is they would find networks and they find more people. They get the names. Right? They check if people were mentioned repeatedly, sometimes just once. They would round them up and bring them in, and he was cross-referencing. So the prosecution said, well, look, you weren't just a relay point. You were active. You were actually really good at your job. You would compile these lists, and you would target people. And he would say, no, I just did that a couple of times, the ones you have the records for. Mm-hmm. But this was back and forth. This is what would take place. So again, why did Duch do this? Yes, he said, I was, at one point I was caught in the gears of the revolutionary machine. And what he recalled during his trial, joining a political movement is like entering into the gears of a revolutionary machine. If you enter into the teeth of the machine that is moving like this, you can't escape. I knew that once I joined the revolutionary movement of the Communist Party, I wouldn't be able to leave it. But, Duch explained, I believed at the time that the revolution would save the people. It was the only path to do so. So we get the same thing. Why did Duch do it? He said he was a Stoic. He invoked French romantic poetry about a wolf who dies to defend its family. He said, I was like this, and then at the end, though it's not in the transcript, he waved in there and said, God, what else could I do? Right? So, that's a lot you could sort of parse out of that. Why did Duch do it? He said, this is, again, something I'll return to, but he said, look, he invoked a Khmer Rouge saying, if I had said anything, it would be like breaking open the crab to show what's underneath. Nobody would do that. You'd be killed. Right? So he invoked this metaphor. You break open the crab, you'll show what's buried underneath the shell. But he said it a little more crassly than that. And I would have been killed, so I had to do it. So Duch had lots of explanations about what he did. So I think I'm going to have to skip over parts of my presentation. How much longer do I can go to about 6 or 7 at this rate, which probably is not, maybe with the traffic in LA, that is something that would be okay. So give me a time frame, and I will speed up accordingly.
Yeah, maybe 10 more minutes.
All right. So I apologize. You're going to see, like images going through, but think of them as little hauntings that pass by as they go. So what are the lessons? We can sort of go back to this in the book. There are echoes with Eichmann in Jerusalem and the lessons there. But you go back, one of the images, and the reason I have the cover is because of this graffitied photograph of Duch at S21. And if you look there in English, it says evil. And there's some other English language, and you also have his eyes being scraped out. But there is also Khmer script. So when people coming often from a Judeo-Christian English language frame look at this, they read it as the devil often, something satanic, a demon. When Cambodians, I talked to Jumai, for example, at Tuol Sleng, I said, hey, that defaced picture of Duch up there, and he laughed and said, yeah, I know. And I said, well, what does it mean exactly? He did that stuff with the eyes, and he goes, oh, it's Buddhist ignorance. So a completely different frame for it. And it matches up with the graffiti. So I immediately knew this notion of, reading certain things, having other stuff be erased from view, fit with the confession, where you had sets of meaning, the articulation of meaning, the redaction, and the production of something that's much more singular and reduced in the end. These two synergies were there, and I apologize for going a little fast. So I talk about, the notion of articulation, You have the articulation of a confession, you have the articulation of a perpetrator. We're getting an articulation of the New York City attacker that's going on. But all of these, of course, are involved redaction. So we have our everyday ways of thinking. We have torture. If I have more time, I go into the redactic, which is etymologically is the notion of pushing back something. So you have tension, as if something may press back forward again. You might think of it as sort of a latent pushback, a potentiality to what Derrida at one time talks about as dehiscence. So there's a dehiscence or a wound, So you have this latent potentiality. And we have the Hulk. Yeah, fans of the Hulk, That's a great example of a latent potentiality that dehisces suddenly. The notion of dehiscence fits with Buddhist psychology, where the self is impermanent and illusory. It also fits with the Lacanian notion of self. Anyways, a number of different resonances. So these are some of the bodies of theory that inform that notion of articulation, redaction, the redactic, and dehiscence. This all leads back to Hannah Arendt and Eichmann in Jerusalem, which many people, sort of flip into, bureaucracy is bad. It leads people to do bad things, but it's actually, the bureaucracy was obviously involved in what Eichmann was doing, but when she talks about it, she refers to sheer thoughtlessness. This comes out of her origins in critical theory, her mentor Heidegger, as well as the Frankfurt School. Anyway, so this is sort of what I wanted to pick up. There were lots of parallels between, there were some parallels between Eichmann and Duch, and as I sort of went through, I wanted to pick up and sort of rethink through this notion of sheer thoughtlessness. But what was striking to me is that it wasn't exceptional. In fact, the thoughtlessness was something that happens all the time and is built into the way that we think as human beings. So it wasn't something that was extraordinary. It was something that was every day. It was this dynamic and part of articulation, redaction, inflected by the thick frames of power. And I apologize, I'm going a little quickly through this. But again, so you have the institutional mobilization, ideological mobilization of these frames to characterize people in reductive ways that fit as well the way people can handle complex amounts of information. We all continually funnel it down and we articulate in reduced, simplified ways. So this is sort of, again, in the 8-minute version, what I'm going to get in trouble, version of what I'm doing with Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil, sort of talking about the banality of everyday thought. So briefly, of DK ideology, producing the monstrous enemy, the other, with the thick frames of the DK party line. But what was striking, and what I didn't get into, which is another aspect, is in fact the law itself is doing exactly the same thing, right? Through the thick frames of power of law and notions of criminality producing the monstrous perpetrator, the other, taking complex people and putting a singular innocent or guilty, criminal, not criminal, right, categorization on a person. You also get it in psychology with the potential rendering of the sociopath, for example, through diagnostic categories. So I mentioned the psychological evaluation. Lots of dehiscence everywhere with all of this. I don't have a lot of time, no time to go into it. Anyways, political things, Buddhism, lots of stuff. Anyways, I apologize, there's not time to go into it. So like the lesson, part of the lesson, again, is I try and reappropriate Duch's somewhat violent saying and reframe it to say, again, like the shell, you know, we're moving and navigating our lives sort of with this shell of articulations, and lots of stuff has been pushed out of sight through our redactions that's there. And to think critically, you need to try and break through and understand what's pushed out of sight. So I'm no time to go through all these, so I'm very quickly, another way to think about it. You know, articulation, redaction, which is pushed out of sight. There's a latent potentiality for something to dehiss. It may or may not dehiss. And you can sort of think through a number of different things. You know, again, this is very quick, big subjects, but memory and forgetting, right? With memory, the potentiality for that. Genocide studies canon. What is genocide? What isn't? Right? Certain cases being pushed back. You alluded to the book before. So here we have the academic frames of power that often legislate and articulate and redact at the same time. Notion of temporality itself. What is an event and what's the duration? In the second book that I've completed, the companion volume, which is coming out next year, it's more of a traditional academic book, but I go into much more detail about a lot of the political redactions, though I don't phrase it in quite that language. I talk about the justice facade in multiple senses, which isn't just to say justice is a facade, but in fact, it's a facade where there's a projection of legal, juridical, transitional justice norms onto these localities. And it's a facade in the sense that there's all sorts of stuff that's going on in the background that nobody knows about. And that book unpacks, for example, the Buddhist meanings. So I'm going to just go, I apologize, the temporal erasures that go on, Buddhist erasures, reductive characterizations of country, spatiality. So I apologize. I was like 15 minutes there in about 2 seconds. I'm going quick now. You should be happy. You know, you go into the notion of victim versus perpetrator. So anyways, and the last sort of cluster of ideas I was going to talk about is the book has a ethical, to go back to this notion of which lessons, an ethical aspect to it. And I think Arendt also, when she talks about a lesson, the banality of evil, is talking in part, not totally in part, about ethics as well. But the notion of critical thinking and the difficulty that all people, we all have our convictions. Look at your Facebook bubbles, right? Those reflect your convictions in many ways because they're your friends and they're all saying the same things. Often in academia, it's going to be sort of anti-Trump things that are circulating. You know, not for everyone, but often that's the case. But again, you know, this is a narrow framing. It's like listening to NPR all the time and not listening to Fox News or Breitbart, right? Other sources of information. So it's a long way of saying, if you look, you know, this notion of conviction, we all have them, but you can have effacing convictions that are such that you have your, you know, beliefs, and you don't turn and look at another person and acknowledge their beliefs, the different sort of beliefs they have that may be in tension with yours. And so it calls for an ethics of effacement, which is an old word. To efface is to turn. People are probably familiar with Levinas, a little bit of Levinas in there as well. You know, and Duch's saying you cannot live without belief. Effacement. And it goes back to the crab, again, this notion, this ethics of trying to continually think critically. If I had more time, I would have talked about there's going to be a book forum on this in the Journal of Genocide Research with 5 different people sending comments. Some of the issues took up the why. The banality of everyday thought was talked about. Sort of law, by saying that it's linked into the banality of everyday thought, does that minimize the capaciousness of law? That was an issue. Some people had questions about the ethnodramatic method that I didn't have time to discuss. So the book is structured as an ethnodrama using literary strategy, show, don't tell, poetic devices. Anyways, that was brought up in the reviews. This is another redaction, a poetic form, an erasure that's in the book. The redactic came up. What had I not paid attention to? The politics, which I talk about in the second book. I do talk about it some, but that was brought up. Local understandings, Buddhism as an issue. And then ethics was another issue. And there was a debate that got going about the extraordinary versus the ordinary. So I maintain that genocide is something that's everywhere, just a step or two away. And another person said it's extraordinary. It's far away from us. And there's sort of a back and forth. Actually, it was he said it, and then I respond in my rejoinder. And then in the end, I say, this is like if you want to talk about genocide prevention, people are always talking about military interventions and other things. I'd make the argument that actually critical thinking and effacement and unpacking redactive ways of characterizing other people is actually a step to the genocide prevention. So the book has an ethics, and it also has, I don't want to say an agenda, but it argues not explicitly, but in the book forum more explicitly that this, in a way, is what you might think of as a critical genocide prevention. And I would say that for all the genocide prevention things that are done, this sort of a critical thinking exercise is just as important as many of them. And of course, the old imperative. So the book has an imperative, right? It says you got to break open the shell of the crab. Thank you. And I end, of course, with the book that never ends, and so I have a haunting at the end of it. So thanks. Sorry I went on so long.
Okay, so we open the floor for comments, questions.
Thank you very much, Gerald. I'm really my professor of Holocaust, so I know nothing or little bit about the Khmer Rouge, so
Sure.
excuse me if I say stupid things. But that also brings me immediately to your point of Hannah Arendt, what's it, sheer thoughtlessness, the theory of the sheer thoughtlessness, because after Arendt there has been, of course, a lot of discussion about her portraying the way she portrays Eichmann. I think one of the last books was David Cesarani, and he makes clear, I think, he has a strong point of saying that Eichmann was not. I mean, this was a defense mechanism, saying, yeah, well, I have this sheer thoughtlessness, or I'm just following orders from above. And if someone asked me to do someone who had red hair, I would do that also. It was just my I think he argues basically that it is a defense mechanism of him in the trials, in the trial. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, if you think about that, and maybe that this way this perpetrator is portraying or presenting himself is also a way of just presenting and trying to get lesser punishment, maybe, I don't know. So that was one thing, and then there was another thing I my glasses on. Yes, what was also striking me very, very much is that the difference in the violence. I mean, in the Holocaust, of course, there was also an enemy within, an enemy without. But the killing was much clearer. I mean, the violence was much clearer. The goal of the violence was really death in most cases. And here is this torture in between. Even if people are, they have nothing to say, but it's torture. So I was just wondering, what is the function? I don't know how you say it in English. Why is that torture in or is that for the perpetrator to get harder? And so I was just, well, I have more questions. It was just a lovely presentation, and I have a lot of questions.
And I promise to finish answering by about 6 o'clock. So, because those are very small questions. All right, so, you know, in terms, the second one first, in terms of the context of S-21, that was one institutional context for killing people. And this one, while they did extract confessions on other levels as well, right, and the information was passed up, you know, everyone who killed wasn't forced to confess and wasn't tortured. Many people were rounded up and simply executed or taken away in the night. So for those who've seen The Father, and you know, I'm just mentioning first They Killed My Father because it came out, it was on Netflix, Angelina Jolie directed it, so I figured a handful of people would have seen it. But if you were one of those, you would have seen, for example, someone who had a corrupt background. They would take their biographies. Sometimes people would say what their background was, and so they would be identified as traitors, or maybe there was a grudge, and they would be taken away. Sometimes large numbers of people were taken away. So there were multiple institutional contexts in which killing took place. This was one. Excuse me. What was distinctive about S-21 is that it was linked to the party center, and they were torturing their own cadre to find out about plots. So the torture was geared, A, to discover plots, or B, depending on who you believe, to eliminate their political enemies by forcing people to torture to produce evidence that would support their treason. So it was used as a tool. Other people have argued that it's to show the modernity, of the regime and the fact it was all-seeing. So it was a distinct context, and I think you have to locate it in that context. And there were many other contexts where people were killed. And I think in all, genocide in general, there's always some degree of ambiguity. So in the Holocaust, you had the racial courts, for example. Hutus, Tutsis, roadblocks. Who are you? I don't have my ID. Okay, well, how do you look? We'll figure out who you are. So this always exists. And certainly in the case of the Khmer Rouge, it was more amplified because it was a political identity, except for in the case of ethnic Vietnamese, Muslim Cham. So there were other, those cases. So there was continual monitoring, and I don't want to go on too long, but they also used the Buddhist notion of impermanence. They used Buddha, even though they banned Buddhism, they used Buddhist concepts in their ideology. So the notion of impermanence was there, that everything's impermanent. So revolutionary consciousness was impermanent as well and could change. So anyone could, today be a friend, tomorrow be a foe. In terms of the second question, the first question, the one quick response is, it doesn't really matter what happened with the debate with Eichmann. It matters in the terms of the Eichmann debate, but it doesn't really matter as much for what I'm trying to do with the concept, because I'm not trying to take her concept and plop it in. I'm trying to rework it in a different way. A way which I would actually say that the way you're talking about anti-Semitism, which has been one of the, a lot of people have come up more recently and talked about Eichmann's anti-Semitism, that fits actually much more directly with what I'm arguing about. So in one response, I'm interested in those arguments about Eichmann and Hannah Arendt, but it doesn't really affect what I'm trying to do. I'm using that idea, revisiting it, readapting it in a different way. But the sort of last thing I'll say is that besides this lesson, the book is not written to tell you whether Duch was a man or a monster. The book is written to make you think about that very conceptualization about what I'm calling the banality of everyday thought. The title is the answer, right? It's not just the question. It's a question, but it's also inflecting towards the answer. So sometimes people will say, well, was Duch a man or a monster? And that's, that's not where I go. So the book, that's part of the reason I chose the ethnodramatic method, which is evocative, it has ambiguity, it has tension. It tries as much as I can not to present a specific articulation of them as a man or a monster, but to present what was going on in the course of this trial. So the book starts and goes through the course of this trial as an ethnodrama. And so for some people, but I guess in my case, since I've written a book called Why Did They Kill Cambodia in the Shadow of Genocide, I can always, as I showed, just point to my other book and say, well, if you really want that kind of an answer, go look at my other book, which takes it very much a sort of anthropological, social, scientific analysis. And it's not the goal of this book.
Okay. Thank you.
Those are two good questions.
Can I just add something to this? So when I saw this you argue a little bit about the thoughtfulness of Duch, right? That he was thoughtful in a way. But I got this right, because you kind of erased the not-thoughtfulness into thoughtfulness. And actually this speaks much more than just anti-Semitism to Eichmann Schmoll, because the research shows him actually as an innovative person, as an initiative person, and not so much, it's not so much about anti-Semitism as kind of the driving factor, but what he did was totally against this clock and a machine or kind of a small wheel. He was really driving things.
Right.
And I think in a way this corresponds very well to how you show Duch also in a way driving things from his standpoint or his kind of level of operation there. So
Yeah.
I think this actually goes very well together with the newer research on Eichmann. So.
Yeah, you know, that's a good point. So in the book, I try not to prioritize one or the other in the book. You know, I actually talk about this in the book forum. The book forum was really a good sort of venue to talk about the book, because I got to talk about a little bit of the backstory. So the book used to end on the chapter before the epilogue. So there's an epilogue at the end, and it actually ended, the first draft ended with the word "the end." That was the end of this chapter. Then there, long sort of reviewer story, reviewer wanted more exposition, and I, fighting against the exposition, literary reviews. So, well, look, you know, once literature review, so I'll do a bit of that, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an epilogue and backlight the book in a completely different way, and in a way it's like a haunting of the book. So, in a way, the book has two endings, and then when I did this postscript, which I'm calling as postscript, and you all know from Arendt, right, there's a postscript, so there's a third iteration is coming out. Again, I'm trying to get this notion of return, doubling, and so the book ends with the word haunting, and the postscript gets this with the notion of review and comes back again. So the notion is to sort of destabilize narratives. At the same time, if you say, well, what's there, you know, that the epilogue highlights the stuff that often people in these sorts of forums will pick up on, even though I'm not talking about the banality of everyday thought for the book. That's something that I mentioned at the beginning briefly, and in the epilogue, and a little bit in the conclusion. But it's not, most of the book is not written that way. It's written in a completely different way. But it's, anyway, so I try as best as I can, but then I was forced in the epilogue and postscript to do more of it. So I battled back as best I could.
I have a question going back to the idea of the trial. Of course, a trial tries to make the point of how much the involvement of the person was in that. But coming back to what Geraldine said, if the moment you see that as a protection and you ignore the entire trial as being something as an ethnodrama, as drama what exists and you're not part of that, you're only defending yourself to keep alive, but I have another opinion and I am playing the game. My question was if that makes sense at all, if we have so partialized view and a divided position completely, if that trial was only, from my point of view, a drama or something presenting a fake trial, and from the other side as looking for some justice.
So the one thing, so I had to go quickly at the end. You remember I had my 3.5-hour version of the talk that I wasn't able to do. The ethnodrama, my book is the ethnodrama as a representation of the trial. I'm not saying that the trial itself is an ethnodrama, even as it has dramatic form, certainly. But the book is what I'm saying is an ethnodrama. And there's a method to what I'm calling ethnodramatic method. And some people, one reviewer, you know, sort of said, well, what exactly is the ethnodramatic method? And so I went a little more into it, and that was raised. That's why I sort of passed through it quickly. But it's using poetic forms, destabilization. The one thing that came up, one reviewer, Devin Pindus, we had this thing where he said, well, isn't law more capacious than you are sort of giving it credit for? And so we got there. So I invoked the notion of the readerly and the writerly, and said, people are familiar with the readerly and the writerly, the Parthian concept, but there's the notion of literature as something that's read authoritatively and in a singular manner, versus literature as something that's meant to be co-opted and appropriated by the reader and read in multiple ways. And so I talk about the readerly and the writerly of law, but I say ultimately law is actually tight and narrow much more than it's capacious. Yeah. Am I right? Am I wrong? I don't know. Go read the book review and you can decide if you agree with me. That's what's great about the book review. It adds more ambiguity. So the form fits perfectly with the book. But that, that came up. So he would say, and then I make the point that there is a capacious dimension because I'm writing an ethnodrama about the trial as an outside person. But at the same time, in the end, like the critique of violence, right? There's the force of law. There's a bottom line. It's linked to power. It's going to render a verdict, and that verdict is going to be enforced. You're convicted or you're not. No, that was my response. But anyways, that's good to have. Again, this is what I like. It's generative because you get two views, and people can decide what they think on their own.
One more question is, was that connected? It was different, the trial, when it was a trial about genocide in the first one?
So the trial itself first was about crimes against humanity, right, and war crimes. Case 2, where Nguyen Chia and Chu Samphan are being tried, is ongoing now. It was split in two. They got convicted for the first one, which was about the forced evacuations. The second part of it is genocide. I actually went and testified as an expert witness about genocide for 3.5 days at the tribunal. So I have another sort of relationship to the tribunal that I haven't written about yet, but I may write about. But that's the genocide component. And we'll get a verdict, I assume probably a conviction, I'm guessing, because of the evidence, but we'll see next year.
May I add something to the genocide question? So I was kind of struck by, which I didn't, by the fact that Duch is ethnic Chinese. And when you think about, let's say, incorporating Cambodia into the genocide canon, one of the, let's say, avenues taken was to focus on ethnic difference. That means the Cham, the ethnic Chinese and the Vietnamese, and to make this as the case for genocide, which obviously is also the case of the trial. But then it kind of gets kind of fuzzy when the perpetrators itself, the ethnic Chinese, first of all. Second of all, if you think what you also presented very well is kind of us and the other. That is actually the difference, not so much the racial connotation or markers for it. So how can you share your thoughts about this?
Well, so if I put on I'm not a lawyer. If I were a lawyer, I could put on my lawyer hat and I would say, hey, you got to stick to the UN Genocide Convention, right? So, but I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have to do that. This was, the testifying was very interesting because I tried to give a lecture about Lemkin at the very beginning of, and they immediately shut me down saying, first of all, he's an anthropologist. At one point he said, Your Honor, he's just an anthropologist. And I was thinking of having that be the title of if I write something. But the other thing is this is a court of law. The definition of genocide is agreed to. So I began to have some back and forth. But I was going to talk about sort of this point about what is the definition of genocide. And I was going to say, well, maybe you could argue that ethnic Chinese were targeted, which is possibly true. That's not there because they, of course, need to get the evidence. They're short on time. But there are other groups, theoretically, they could have fit with the UN Genocide Convention, Buddhist monks as well. But they didn't have time. So they went for the two that are easier to prove, which is ethnic Vietnamese and Muslim Chams. But my own scholarly definition is, again, to me, the key thing is the identification of other groups of people, however they're defined, as others, and that's genocide. However, so that's exactly it. But I didn't really get the chance to articulate that in court. So I tried. I did have a couple okay moments, and during the course of it, but they got me right at the beginning. My Lemkin lecture was not given. It was redacted and is waiting to the hiss in my book or article. It's still there.
What did you think about, just staying on the trial for a minute, what did you think about the fact that one of the defendants spoke specifically about your testimony?
That's the beginning of my, I have to say, so I have 2 books so far. Do I want to write a 3rd short book? I don't know. I've got to decide because I just finished the other one that's coming out. But it would start at that moment. I have a short essay And that's sort of the question. But then, so he asked about U.S. bombing. That's an interesting way to inflect it. But that book, if I write it, will actually talk about sort of genocide in the world today and perpetrators, and be different than Man or Monster. Will be different than the Justice Facade. It'll take up a more comparative, broad purview. But I'm not sure if I have the energy to do it. We'll see. But it was pretty shocking that this is the number 2 person under Pol Pot, Nuangia, and he's on a boycott. But I irritated him a little bit when I said he was doing genocidal incitement, so he felt compelled to come up. And then the last thing was an exchange between him and me. And so that would be the sort of the beginning of the other book. I was glad he went up. Better to speak than to be silent. So I was pleased. But it was,
I was wondering if you had a chance to have a dialogue with the director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College.
At Bard.
Yeah,
I was just at Bard recently,
Yeah.
but I haven't yet had a discussion. But
that would be
But I asked about I was on a college tour for my kids, but I asked about the Hannah Arendt Center. I was very excited,
Yeah.
but I didn't have time to go over there.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, I thought about
I was just
contacting them.
wondering,
Yeah.
it would be an interesting dialogue you could have.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, well, you do Hannah Arendt,
Yeah.
Banality of Evil,
Yeah.
Eichmann, and everyone will disagree with whatever's said. People have 100 different
And
readings, so.
Genocide as well, right?
Which part of the genocide?
You know, with Cambodia and whatever, and what you brought up, I would like to, it would be interesting to see what their take would be on what you said.
About whether it was a genocide?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's pretty easy to, I mean, that's old, that's an old argument that's been, I just tell them to go read Why Did They Kill, and it sort of takes it up, but that's, anyways. So usually in the debates about was it genocide, if you have a legal definition, there's sort of different tracks. One is you have ethnic Vietnamese, Muslim Jains, Buddhist monks. You also have some scholars are now saying the notion of a national group is a broader category where political enemies potentially can come back in again. So there are a number of different ways, and we're going to have what I'm pretty sure is a conviction for genocide, which will sort of within that debate. As a scholar, ultimately, it's knowledge is being produced in different ways. I'm curious to see what happens. I don't have a particular stake in putting a big stamp on it, but depending on how knowledge and epistemologies are mobilized, I think in most of those different ways, it qualifies as genocide. And certainly in the way we were just talking about production of others, that there's no doubt. But even with a very sort of tight definition of genocide, a legal definition, but we'll see, right? So we'll find out what the verdict is. Though people will say, oh, it was wrong, it shouldn't have been labeled genocide, and others will say, if it comes out and they say it wasn't genocide, but they won't say it wasn't, they say we don't have enough evidence to convict of genocide. So even then there's going to be ambiguity. So we'll see.
Hi. Quick question. As an expert in the field, I want to know what you would have to say to certain people that would state that genocide is inevitable.
That genocide, probably genocide I would say is inevitable in the sense that I think it will return, it will dehiss, so to speak. If you're going back to the comments on extraordinary versus ordinary, is that what you were? Yeah, so that I expect that and want that to be a controversial, provocative statement. But sort of the quick answer is that I think it's a very comforting thought to think that genocide is something that's extraordinary, it's extreme, it's far away and distant from us. Whereas the way I look at it is the dynamics involved in genocide, many of them are around us all the time. And the book is arguing that, in fact, the very way we think, we all continually are reducing, articulating, so I'll talk about my Facebook feed, characterizations of Donald Trump. Very reductive, typecasting, so, people, even if I say that, and a lot of my Facebook circle of friends, they're going to say, how can you even bring up something like that? But it's very reductive, narrow formulations of him. And that's, again, banality of everyday thought. Now, what is Trump doing? He's doing it all over the place, of course, right? I mean, that's clear. But the thing is, the notion that, I would never do that, very clearly in my own Facebook feed, there's evidence of it. And it's my inclination as well as someone who is not a great fan of Donald Trump. So I feel myself wanting to characterize him in reductive ways. You can all think about your Facebook feeds and see what you're reading and what you think about Donald Trump for some, anyways. but that's a tip of the iceberg. Anyways, so for me, it's not 7 degrees of separation. It's like 2 degrees of separation, maybe 1 degree of separation. Sometimes I talk about 9/11 as well, day before, day after, right? That was an example of a situation where you say we're nowhere near genocide or mass violence or bad things happening, and in one day things were very different. The potentiality was different. Devin Pindus he's the one who was arguing about the extraordinary, and I will very much stick to the ordinary part of it. But I want that again. I like the fact that there are two positions people can read about and debate, because these are important issues, and people have different opinions, and it's good to have that debate, which is a great thing about a book forum.
I'm really intrigued by the idea that you're suggesting that you wrote this book really as a sort of exercise in thoughtfulness and the sort of Arendt, in the way that I think Arendt intended to sort of provoke people to do. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about, and maybe I might have missed this, but how do you give instructions to readers of your book about how to read it as a sort of intellectual exercise? And also, do you envision the book being offered to Cambodian audiences, and do you think that it would be read, do you think that you would offer different instructions for reading it in that context, or how would you think about that?
Yeah, so those are good questions. It's not in the keeping of the spirit to formulate things as I formulated them here. But I do formulate them the way I try and do in a sort of haunted trickster way in the postscript. I try and be true to the spirit, but I do talk about things more directly. But I talk about critical thinking pretty directly, and I think it's pretty evident. You have to ask readers. I've assigned it in a class, and the students undergraduates have picked up on it pretty clearly. It actually begins with the notion of framing, because, right, Duch's in a frame. And so it begins with, and then we get thick frames of power, and that's something that, the students have really picked up on. The book isn't meant, though, to be written. So I was coerced, I was forced by the power of academic review to add an epilogue that does it more. And now I'm not being coerced, but I'm glad to participate and write a postscript and that's what these book reviews are for, in large part, is used in teaching, because it takes up these sorts of issues. But it wouldn't be true to the spirit. But I have talked about the book. The book is in Cambodia. There's a PDF of it floating around for people to use and read. And please take that off the camera. Shouldn't have had that down there. And I've also taught about critical thinking in a teacher training program, using ideas from the book. But it's, in a certain way, it's very much meant to be sort of critical pedagogy. That's the lesson. Most academic books, people will not say, I have ethics, I have an imperative, and I have a lesson. I've revealed my secret agenda. I have, even if they do, but I say ethics, lesson. There's a crab, the crab provides an imperative that people remember. I bring prevention, which many academics hear the word prevention, and they go the other direction, but I'm engaging critical prevention studies, whatever it's called. So anyways, I want to do all those things, and I think it's important to do it, especially at this moment in time.
I'm particularly intrigued by the, you referenced a little bit the sort of Buddhist ways of talking about, like, for example, the scratching out of the eyes, this sort of Buddhist thoughtlessness. And I'm curious to see what will happen with the book in the Cambodian context. Partly, I have done some work on Thailand, and the sort of the ways that the sort of Buddhist philosophies about thoughtlessness and engagement and responsibility, I think, are very apropos to what your work is about.
And the Justice Facade takes a Buddhism much more. It goes much further with the Buddhism part, because again, this book is written so I talked to Jumai and Bumang, who are two of the prisoner survivors, and I talked to them about their Buddhist beliefs, and that's how I would weave in things like Buddhism into it. But it's definitely there. Yeah, lots of good questions.
Oh, no, sorry.
She got the first question before we began. Yeah.
It wasn't, I wasn't raising my hand, sorry.
Okay. Well, we already had a discussion before, too. Yeah.
But maybe coming back to the title of your book, and I was intrigued to that you had these comments about Duch, let's say, as a teacher, kind, gentle, never kind of in a rage, and so, and then you had these comments on how he operated as a torturer, or commanding torture, or kind of initiating torture. So the question is, how do you bring this, these two very kind of contradictory opinions about a person together? How do you mediate this? Is this possible? Then this is the kind of the essential question for any perpetrator study, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Ethnodrama, through the ethnodramatic method, which the goal isn't to render a singular articulation and answer the question. The goal is to present the ambiguity and tension and multivocality that exists. So it's precisely that I bring up in the same way. You know, a different way to present this would have been more experimental. You know, and so there's a way to present it more experimentally. I did a little bit of that, but doing a series of juxtapositions, right, which is another way I have to present the book. But yeah, anyways, I chose to do some. I mean, also I don't know if anyone knows that, you know, this is also supposed to connote the notion of redaction with the black and the white. This is like, I just created this for this presentation as well. And then behind a lot of these is actually the redacted apology of Duch. So I redacted Duch's apology. I took it, I put it on the PowerPoint slide. I erased it all through this, and then I put on words. So part of this is actually created out of that. Don't ask me why, you know, I'm not sure, but the idea is that there's something behind it that's been pushed out of sight, you know, so there's not just, there is something behind there.
So I'm curious now, as I've listened to your presentation and heard people's questions, at what point did you decide to write about this in this ethno-drama way? I mean, what led to your decision?
Much later. It was like, you know, I knew the photo. I knew that was the cover. In fact, another backstory I should have written about it, I didn't get to put it in the book form, is that the book actually went to a publisher. The publisher was all ready to go. The publisher didn't like the title and didn't like the photograph. And I walked away. Yeah, that's another backstory. So that, to me, that's just how important that is to the book. And by the way, when it's been peer reviewed, to walk away and to have to do it again is anyways. And if I were a junior scholar, I wouldn't have done it probably, and I would have been forced by the system to abandon what was important to me. But I could do it because I have tenure, you know. But that was something where, anyway. So that's another backstory. But to answer the question, it was much later when I was trying to work through the material and figure out what to do, and you know, the ambiguity, and then I had. And then again, a lot of it was looking at that graffitied image of Duch. Like that's how it really got going. It emerged out of that photo.
Because it seems,
I'm sorry, as if it's right there.
The way you presented it here, when you show the television week of Duch on trial, and you've chosen those 2 days, I mean, that in a way, it seems to be the heart of what you're dramatizing.
Yeah. Well, it's one manifestation of that binary articulation of Duch, where there were many of them. So, you know, you look at closing.
That one to show us.
Yeah, they're just moments that illustrate. And if I were high tech, I would have actually just clicked on it, and it would have popped up at the moment they said it. But I'm not high tech. I can get like the little video or audio recording, but I'm not high tech enough. This computers. I'm going to take this computer. It seems like a very high-tech computer. Yeah, thank you. I like it. It's good for the PowerPoint. But anyways, I think probably you could do something like that more easily with a souped-up computer versus my computer, because you'd have to skip around. Anyways, yeah. So you were meant to see that actually in action would have been ideal.
So for those of us who are a little bit on the younger side, I was wondering, for those of us who are interested in going a little bit more in depth into this period of Cambodian history, if there were any, you could recommend any good scholarly sources.
I can recommend lots of sources. Don't look in Man or Monster, because I tried not to include, I tried to get out of that but yeah, no, I'm happy to recommend sources to you. The news source where I would go, if you're trying to do something different, is go into the trial transcripts. There's so much stuff that's online that's waiting to be used. I mean, you see, so this book came out of a trial, but there's a second case with far more that's there. And, you know, so I wouldn't say the literature is not dated and people got a lot of it right, but there's just a huge amount of new material and the documents are there. And for people who don't speak Khmer, a bunch of it's translated. You know, I did my research, nothing was translated. So it's, you know, it's an incredible resource. So if you go to the tribunal website and put down declassified documents, all sorts of, and millions of confessions that have been, you know, in Khmer and in English, but, you know, and you have the testimony that's there, and they actually have a decent system for, you can look and see who testified when. But that would be a direction, I would read the material, but I would also be heading to the tribunal and all the material that's underexplored at this point. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Oh, I'm actually a senior at UCLA. I know.
See, we're going to get the banality of everyday thought, right? We get the other is here and you know, the academic other. Yeah.
And I'm doing my senior thesis on the Khmer Rouge, but specifically on the persecution of ethnic Vietnamese minorities. And like coming off what she said, like, is there a specific source specifically just for that? Like,
I would be heading, if I were doing that, I'd be definitely going to the tribunal and looking at the segments of the tribunal. I mean, I'll pop up there as well when I did expert testimony a little bit, but they have all sorts of material. I mean, if you're doing it, want to do primary research and use primary materials, that's where I would definitely go. Yeah, and there's not, the academic literature, there's not that much there really, and a lot of it's repetitive. You know, the Bing Kieran stuff, which you probably looked at, which is good, and was done early, but now you have all this other material. Yeah, the tribunal will be, even though I have a book called The Justice Facade coming out, they'll be very happy that I'm saying go consult the archives. Well, good luck as well on that.
How did writing this book in the form that you wrote it affect how you wrote the second book?
It's very, very difficult to write the second book. Second book is, you know, I'm sort of personally committed to writing clearly and trying to write in an engaging manner and trying to stay away from theory. You know, I'm even wary about saying the word dehiscence because some people, and if you couple it with Derrida, people, you know, throw tomatoes at you or something when you're up here, but it's, yeah, or you just have the Hulk.
Yeah,
Which, you know, like you provide something that makes it concrete, but it's a useful idea. But anyways, second book was extremely difficult to write because I had to return to academic, more traditional expository anthropological writing, but I had, so another backstory to the book, and this one I tell in the book forum, is that actually I got really excited about the project. I was going, and I finished it, and I did a word check, and it was at 260,000 words. So for those who, you know, people don't know the book, so, you know, everyone wants a 100,000 word book, 300 pages. So this thing was coming in at 600 plus. And so I actually had to go, and maybe this is ultimately the compulsion to redact. I had to chop out, I had an entire chapter actually on the psychological evaluation that I had to take out, and it's actually pretty important to the argument. I went through much more of the tribunal, so I had to do all sorts of cutting down of the book and all sorts of parts of it. But I also had my original project. This wasn't my original project. This was a side project in a weird way. I was no idea I would end up doing it. But then I had all this material to do this second book, and I'm glad I did it, but it was very hard to return to writing in an expository way. So if I would say my view, and people in creative writing don't like it, because I tell students, go take journalism class, take an MFA class, hone your writing skills, unlearn all of the bad things you're learning. You know, I say, you're being disciplined, you're being turned into a disciple, to go back to that etymology, and no one likes to be discipled. And so people then, you get a little bit of the fight back. But we're trained to be lousy, well, I'll speak for myself. I was trained to be a lousy writer. And I think most academics are mediocre writers. There are certainly exceptions. And I think part of that's the way we train students. And what we should be doing is training students to write in different sorts of ways with multiple tools. And the system really fails people. And there's the reward system, is that you're rewarded for writing in that manner. And actually another, Lee Payne in her book forum review made the point that I could it's sort of dangerous to write a book like this for the author, because it's unconventional and you sort of expose yourself in a different sort of way. And she said, well, what about, people of color? What about women? What about certainly junior scholars? Could they have done the same thing? That's a good point. I was in a position where I could do this, but I guarantee you, if Why Did They Kill were Man or Monster, I would have caved in, gotten rid of the title, gotten rid of the book cover, and I would have written a much more straightforward book, because the incentives are there to do what's accepted and rewarded. And so that's another big breakdown. But now I can do, I don't want to say whatever I want, but I have lots of latitude to experiment.
I'm not sure if I'm correct, but wasn't there a journalist from the New York Times who was the very first one to bring the focus in what was happening in Cambodia, the genocide of the United States? Who was there? Was there?
Are you thinking of Duch and the Killing Fields? And because that was
a journalist,
yeah,
the
but the,
American
yeah,
journalist, wasn't it, who wrote extensively about this?
yeah, I'm blanking on his name. He just died. He's the person in the Killing Fields.
Yeah.
Sidney Shamberg. I believe.
Shamberg,
Yeah.
Sidney Shamberg.
Yeah, he was
yes.
doing that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wrote extensive, I
Yeah,
remember
yeah.
reading all his articles about it. He was the first one to bring a focus
Yeah.
into what was happening there. So
Yeah.
that's also,
Yeah. Now
it's not scholarly, but it's what he observed, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Anyone who tried to write an op-ed, writing an op-ed is not easy.
Yeah.
Writing in a journalistic style is not easy. There's a craft to it. It's difficult to be succinct. Journalists know that there's incredible complexity that they have to take down and fit within the number of words they have. So if you write an op-ed, you may have 700 words to write your op-ed. It's really hard to do. So I have a lot of respect for journalists, and sometimes, as well, if you're interviewed by the media, anthropologists and academics are often lousy at those things because it's really hard to pare things down, but it's a real skill. And it's something, again, in our training, I think that we could be much better trained at it, because you can do it, but most people don't know how, and even worse than that, many people turn up their noses and say, why would I want to do that?
I haven't seen all of Ken Burns' Vietnam series, but
For good reason, it's so long.
Right, but I have seen half of it, and there are mentions, of course, of Cambodia. So my question to you is whether you actually had seen parts of it that deal with Cambodia, and to what extent do they? And if they do, what do you think?
Yeah, and I've just seen tiny bits of it. I haven't. I mean, that's the type of thing where you've got to really commit a long period of time to go through it. Yeah. So I haven't, but I'm looking forward to it.
Just a really quick question. I didn't finish your book, so if you answered this, I apologize. But in the beginning, you wrote about going through the museum and looking at the captions and how they don't translate very well, and then you get to the point where you actually see your own name as either one or like.
Yeah.
Is it still there or not? Or
Yeah,
is it
it's still there. Yeah. So the book used to have, amongst the 260,000 words that were redacted, there was a lot more on tool slang, the history of tool slang, and all of that got cut out. So it's like, again, redacted material may. And I'm writing another essay now that sort of speaks to some of that material. But so there was a moment I went back to the room that Duch's photo's in, and I was reading through text, and I was like, so I'm going to go and I'm going to deconstruct this text, and I'm going to see how it's producing knowledge in the context of this museum. And I paused and I said, who wrote this? And I looked down. It was me. That's a true story. I was like shocked. My text is sitting right next to that Duch photograph, and I was trying to, deconstruct this text, and I was the author of the text. It was really, an uncanny experience. It was, and one reviewer said, "No way, that could not have happened."
I think I said that out loud by accident. I was reading and I was like, no way did it.
Yeah. No, a reviewer said there's no way that happened. Yeah, so it happened, but it was a really weird experience, especially just because it was right next to that photograph. But you go there, but so a lot of the book has an anthropology and the positioning of the person, bringing the person into the narrative. That's something that's often done. It's a legacy of sort of postmodernism, and so the book very much has that in it. It's like anyway, so a number of different moments. Sort of, I'm positioned. I have a dream in the book at one point. That's an actual dream that I had. It begins with a dream. But.
Okay, I think we are, yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
For this, I think, very interesting and creative approach to this complicated life of a person. And so I'm really thankful that you shared this with us.
Thanks, and we will have the dehiscence later.
Yeah.
And spirits of the dead. Thank you.